going on?
Combine.
Ask her why she thought no one would believe me.
You can apologize to me, or you can explain to Ethan why 12 people left this house before I did. Nia's voice carried through the half-open pantry door just as Ethan stepped in from the service hallway, 3 hours earlier than anyone expected, because weather had canceled his flight to Chicago. He stopped before entering not because Nia had raised her voice, but because she had not. The calmness in it sounded deliberate, the kind people used when they knew anger would later be entered into evidence against them. Caroline stood beside the marble island in the ivory suit she had worn to a charity luncheon, one hand resting near a riding crop she had apparently taken from the mudroom after returning from the stables. On the floor between them lay a silver tray, 2 broken champagne flutes, and a folded sheet of paper Ethan could not read from the doorway. Nia's cuff had come loose, but otherwise she looked exactly as she always did while working in his townhouse, composed enough that wealthy guests mistook her self-control for ease. Caroline saw Ethan first, and for one brief second the confidence left her face before she arranged it back into something polished. "Ethan, this looks worse than it is," she said, and Nia gave a quiet laugh that carried no amusement at all. Ethan entered slowly, his phone vibrating again inside his coat, with calls about the merger his board intended to close within the week. "Then tell me what it is," he said, looking first at Caroline and then at Nia, who bent to pick up the tray as if completing the task mattered more than defending herself. Caroline explained that Nia had been insubordinate, had accessed private household files without permission, and had threatened to embarrass her publicly unless several former employees received money they were not owed. Each accusation sounded specific enough to be plausible, and Ethan hated himself for noticing that before he noticed the way Nia's fingers tightened around the tray. "Is any of that true?" he asked her, choosing the question carefully because he knew Caroline would remember every word. Nia placed the tray on the counter and answered without looking away from him. "I kept records of schedules, payroll changes, complaints, and resignations because people kept disappearing from this house, and nobody seemed interested in why." Caroline's mouth hardened. "You see what she's doing? She has been building a case against us for months." Nia reached into her apron pocket, removed a sealed envelope with Ethan's name written across it, and set it on the counter. "No, I've been building a company. This was the part I hoped I would never need." That answer shifted something in the room, though Ethan could not yet tell whether it shifted toward truth or toward a more sophisticated deception. Caroline immediately seized the opening, saying Nia had been using confidential information to develop a hospitality consulting business called Carter Standard, which Ethan had never heard mentioned despite employing her for nearly a year. She added that Nia had asked vendors questions about staffing costs, copied scheduling models, and cultivated relationships with former employees after they left, all while pretending she was merely a housekeeper. Nia did not deny any of it, which disturbed Ethan more than a defensive explanation would have, but she pointed toward the folded sheet near the broken glass. It was a resignation letter dated the previous morning, 24 hours before the confrontation, stating that she intended to leave because the household had become professionally unsafe, and because her request to use anonymous operational data for a business proposal had been approved months earlier. Ethan recognized his electronic signature at the bottom of the attached authorization, though he had no memory of reading what he had approved. Caroline watched his expression and said quietly, "Ambitious people know how to make permission look broader after the fact." For the first time, uncertainty entered the room honestly. Nia might be telling the truth. Caroline might be manipulating facts, or Ethan might have created an environment in which both women had learned to use his inattentiveness for entirely different reasons. He turned toward Caroline and asked about the riding crop, refusing to let the larger dispute erase the immediate one. She said she had carried it inside after riding and had never threatened Nia with it, while Nia confirmed that Caroline had not struck her or raised it against her. What Caroline had done, Nia explained, was block the pantry doorway after demanding she surrender the envelope, then tell her that nobody in Ethan's world would believe a domestic employee over the woman he planned to marry. Caroline interrupted, insisting Nia had deliberately provoked the confrontation, because reporters were already outside covering the wedding, and any scandal would increase the visibility of Carter Standard. Ethan listened until both stopped speaking, then picked up the riding crop and placed it inside a cabinet, where it should have been from the beginning. "Caroline, go home tonight," he said, and when she stared at him, he added that this was not a verdict against her, only the end of a situation that had already become unacceptable. Her face tightened with something deeper than anger. "My father meets your board at 8 tomorrow morning, and half the financing for your acquisition depends on that relationship." Ethan met her gaze. "Then tomorrow is going to be complicated." Nia untied her apron before he could say anything else, folded it once, and placed her house keys on top. Ethan told her she did not have to leave until the facts were reviewed, but she shook her head because remaining under his roof while he decided whether she was credible would make every hour another audition for basic trust. "Read the envelope before you decide who anyone is," she said, lifting her coat from the chair. "And when you get to the last page, ask yourself why I waited this long to give it to you." Ethan glanced down at the envelope and noticed something he had missed before. A second name written beneath his own in smaller letters. Daniel Brooks, his chief of staff, had apparently been meant to receive a copy. When Ethan looked up again, Nia was already at the doorway, and Caroline was staring at the envelope as though she knew exactly what might be inside. "Nia?" Ethan called, but she stopped without turning. "Tonight was not the reason I quit," she said. "Tonight was just the first time you happened to be standing close enough to hear why." Then she left through the service hall, carrying nothing from the house except the worn leather portfolio Caroline had called evidence against her. Ethan opened the envelope after Caroline left, expecting either an accusation or a strategy, and found something more difficult to dismiss because it had been organized like an operations report rather than a grievance. The first pages listed 12 former employees, including drivers, kitchen staff, personal assistants, temporary servers, and housekeepers, with dates of employment, requests for reassignment, payroll discrepancies, schedule changes, and references withheld after minor disagreements. Besides several names, Nia had attached copies of messages that had been forwarded to his office months earlier, which meant the problem had not existed completely outside his view. She had also included a 42-page proposal for Carter Standard, along with the authorization Ethan had signed, allowing her to use fully anonymized workflow data from the residents, and Caroline's accusation that Nia had secretly stolen information began to weaken. Yet the final page created a larger question because it contained 3 email headers without the messages beneath them, each sent directly to Ethan, and each marked as forwarded to Caroline within minutes. Beneath them, Nia had written only one sentence: "If you want to understand why people stopped complaining, start with what happened after they tried." He spent the next morning doing something his lawyers advised against, calling former employees personally instead of allowing counsel to collect controlled statements. Luis, his former driver, initially refused to meet, then agreed to coffee after Ethan promised there would be no non-disclosure agreement and no request to defend anyone publicly. Luis described schedule changes made without warning, repeated demands that he report which staff members spoke privately, and a pattern in which Caroline remained gracious whenever Ethan was present, but treated questions as disloyalty when he was not. Megan, a cook who had left after 6 weeks, remembered being praised in front of dinner guests and humiliated afterward for altering a garnish Caroline had previously approved. Another housekeeper described requesting Saturdays off to care for her father, only to find herself scheduled every Saturday for the following month, after Caroline called the request inconvenient. None of the stories sounded dramatic enough to become a scandal by itself, which made the pattern more believable rather than less. They were not tales of theatrical cruelty. They were stories about power used in small, deniable increments, until leaving seemed safer than protesting. Daniel arrived at Ethan's office before noon, carrying an archived folder he had clearly hoped never to reopen. "I should have pushed harder," he said, before Ethan asked, then showed him the forwarding history that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Luis had sent a reassignment request directly to Ethan 8 months earlier, and Ethan had forwarded it to Caroline with the message, "Can you handle this?" Megan's note had received almost the same response, while a third employee describing what she called an atmosphere of retaliation had been answered with, "Please resolve before Friday." Ethan remembered writing none of them, not because someone else had used his account, but because each message had occupied less than a minute between meetings that had seemed more important. "Why didn't you bring this back to me?" he asked Daniel, and Daniel answered with more honesty than comfort. Because you made it clear household issues belonged with Caroline, and because every time somebody left, the house still ran. That explanation exposed the architecture of the problem. Caroline had used the authority Ethan delegated, Daniel had followed the hierarchy Ethan created, and Nia had spent months making the consequences invisible by quietly fixing whatever broke afterward. That afternoon, Ethan found Nia at a coffee shop on Lenox Avenue, after asking, not instructing, whether she would meet him on neutral ground. She arrived carrying the same worn portfolio and listened while he admitted he had found the emails, though she showed no satisfaction when he said he could no longer pretend he had simply been deceived. Caroline may have abused authority, but I built the system that gave her authority without oversight, he said, and Nia stirred her coffee before answering. That's closer. Ethan wanted to apologize, but instead asked about Carter Standard, because he now understood that treating her only as the injured employee would erase the other reason she had been gathering information. Nia told him she had worked as an operations supervisor for a downtown hotel group before her mother needed surgery and rising rent forced her toward private household work that paid nearly twice as much. Carter Standard was designed to train luxury residences and boutique hotels to deliver exceptional service without creating cultures where employees had to become invisible. Ethan offered to invest, believing for several seconds that money could become a practical form of respect, and Nia rejected him before he finished describing the terms. If your name funds my first contract, she said, people will spend years deciding whether I built the company or whether you built me. The refusal embarrassed him because it was strategically correct, not because it was emotional. He asked what she needed instead, and she said clients, time, a fair opportunity to compete, and the freedom to fail without having her failure interpreted as proof that she had never belonged near wealthy rooms. Before leaving, she warned him that Caroline would not continue fighting over what happened in the pantry because that argument could be investigated. She would move toward motive, where facts became easier to blur. Ethan asked what she meant, and Nia opened her portfolio long enough to show him screenshots of anonymous messages she had received that morning accusing her of planning to seduce him, blackmail him, and use the wedding scandal to market her company. Nobody has published these yet, she said, closing the folder. But somebody is testing the story before they feed it to reporters. Ethan asked whether she believed Caroline was responsible, and Nia refused to make the accusation without evidence. That's the difference between us right now, she said. I can't afford to be wrong in public. By 7 the next morning, the first photograph of Nia, carrying groceries outside her Harlem apartment, appeared online beneath a headline questioning whether Ethan's former housekeeper had planned a financial claim for months. An hour later, a business site published details about Carter Standard that had never been released publicly, including a projected first-year revenue figure contained only in her private proposal. By 9, television commentators were asking whether the confrontation had been staged to launch her brand, while Caroline issued a carefully written statement acknowledging tension but suggesting Nia had become unusually interested in Ethan's private affairs. Ethan knew immediately that someone had leaked the proposal, yet only a small number of people had possessed it before the scandal. When he called Nia, she answered on the third attempt and listened while he offered to unleash Whitmore's communications team against the story. No, she said, looking through her apartment window at 2 reporters already waiting across the street. If you fight Caroline for me, I become the object you two are fighting over. Ethan asked what she intended to do instead. Nia looked at the Carter Standard folder on her table, then at the resignation letter that had started everything. Something your world isn't expecting, she said. I'm going to speak before either of you decides what my story is worth. Nia chose Dana Holloway, a labor reporter known for long interviews rather than celebrity ambushes, and agreed to appear only if the conversation focused on workplace systems instead of her private relationship with Ethan or Caroline. She wore a navy blouse, her mother's old watch, and no expression of grievance when Dana asked whether she intended to sue for money. I'm not asking anyone to believe I was a perfect employee, Nia said. I'm asking why perfection would be required before a worker deserves ordinary respect. She explained turnover patterns, retaliation through schedules, the fear of losing references, and the quiet calculations service workers made before deciding whether a complaint was worth risking rent. When Dana asked about Carter Standard, Nia disclosed the authorization Ethan had signed months earlier and admitted openly that she wanted to build a business from lessons learned in hospitality. "Ambition is not evidence of fraud," she said, without looking toward the camera. "If anything, the fact that I had somewhere else I wanted to go is why I finally stopped accepting what was happening where I was." By evening, the interview had spread far beyond New York, and for the first time, the public discussion moved away from whether Nia was likable enough to believe and toward whether private workplaces should have meaningful oversight at all. Ethan's communications director prepared a statement praising Nia's courage, but he declined to release it after realizing that attaching his approval to her credibility would reproduce the exact hierarchy she had described. Instead, he asked outside counsel to trace access to the Carter Standard proposal, and the first surprise arrived within hours. Caroline had not obtained the revenue projections from the household computer. Daniel had emailed the document to a Mercer family attorney 8 weeks earlier while preparing materials for a planned merger-related background review of everyone with access to Ethan's residence. Daniel insisted the request had appeared routine because the merger involved heightened security concerns, and Ethan believed him because he could see how easily corporate procedure had become another doorway into a private employee's life. The Mercer attorney denied leaking anything, but metadata showed the file had been downloaded twice after Nia resigned, once from Caroline's personal account and once from an address belonging to a public relations consultant her family had used for years. It was not proof that Caroline had ordered the media attack, though it narrowed the possibilities enough that Ethan's lawyers wanted an immediate confrontation. He refused, knowing accusation without evidence would allow Caroline to portray herself as the victim of a man desperate to impress another woman. Caroline moved first, not through the press but through the board, where the stakes were larger than reputation. Whitmore Urban Holdings was 48 hours from completing a multi-billion-dollar acquisition involving redevelopment projects, pension commitments, construction contracts, and roughly 6,000 jobs, while Mercer Capital represented enough of the financing to destabilize the transaction if withdrawn. At Wednesday's emergency meeting, Chairman Richard Hale placed Nia's interview beside every director's folder and warned Ethan that moral clarity did not excuse fiduciary recklessness. Nobody defended Caroline's conduct. Instead, they argued that no verified finding existed yet, that Ethan's personal household crisis was contaminating corporate operations, and that separating the two protected employees who had nothing to do with his private life. General counsel produced a statement promising cooperation with an independent review, but its final paragraph described the scandal as a private dispute between two women that should not interfere with ongoing business. Ethan demanded the line be removed, then watched the chief financial officer place a downside model beside him, showing what a failed closing might cost if the Mercer family walked. Cowardice rarely arrived calling itself cowardice, he discovered. Sometimes it arrived carrying payroll projections and asking whether one person's dignity justified risking thousands of other people's security. Richard gave him 20 minutes, and during 17 of them, Ethan refused the language before allowing himself to imagine construction crews laid off, retirement funds damaged, and communities blaming him for sacrificing a deal over an unresolved household accusation. He persuaded himself that the investigation would correct the record later, that the sentence did not name Nia, and that temporarily stabilizing the acquisition was different from denying what he had learned. Then he signed. Nia read the statement while sitting at a public library desk, revising Carter Standard's financial projections because reporters had made working from home impossible. She reached the final paragraph twice before accepting that she had not misunderstood it. Weeks of records, 12 former employees, retaliatory scheduling, leaked documents, and an unequal system had been compressed into a phrase that made the problem sound like two emotional women inconveniencing serious businessmen. Ethan called 11 minutes later, and she declined the first call before answering the second because she wanted to hear whether he understood what he had done without being coached toward the answer. He found her that evening outside a co-working space on 125th Street, where she allowed him to speak until every corporate argument had exhausted itself. "The acquisition affects thousands of people," he said, admitting that Mercer financing might collapse if the company appeared to take sides before the review. Nia nodded, because the risk was real, which somehow made what followed harder. "Then say the truth," she told him. "Say you decided those thousands of people were important enough that I could absorb being publicly diminished for a few days." Ethan protested that he had never intended to diminish her, and Nia's expression changed more from disappointment than anger. Intent is what powerful people discuss after somebody else has already paid the consequence. He told her he had been trying to protect the company, but she reminded him that he had once claimed the difference between them was that he now understood what silence cost. "You saw me when seeing me was emotionally difficult," she said. "The moment seeing me became financially expensive, you looked away." She returned the business card he had given her after their coffee meeting, though her fingers trembled slightly before she released it. Ethan asked what she wanted from him, expecting anger, an apology, or an impossible demand he could at least attempt to satisfy. "Nothing," she said. "That's the part you keep missing. My life cannot become the project that proves you're a good man." Then she walked toward the subway without waiting for him to answer. Ethan remained under the winter lights holding the card and understood that Caroline had not manipulated this decision. Daniel had not delegated it, and the board had not signed his name for him. For the first time since the pantry, there was no ambiguity about who had failed Nia. He had done it himself. For 48 hours, Ethan did not call Nia, send flowers, draft an apology, or ask anyone to explain his motives on television, because every familiar method of repair depended on his ability to control the next scene. Instead, he returned to the statement he had signed and asked a question that made the acquisition itself look different. If the truth remained true only when it was inexpensive, what exactly had he been defending? He ordered outside counsel to begin an independent review with authority over household records, private office complaints, vendor correspondence, and every message previously forwarded to Caroline. He authorized release of the 3 employee complaints his own office had failed to examine, then instructed legal counsel to notify the board before publishing a corrected corporate statement. Richard called within minutes and told him the Mercer family would suspend financing, which could delay the acquisition for months and might cost Ethan the chairmanship. "You do not get to gamble with 6,000 jobs because you feel guilty about one woman," Richard said. Ethan looked at the original statement on his desk and answered, "I already gambled with one woman's name because 6,000 jobs gave me a respectable excuse. I'm not doing it twice." The corrected statement withdrew the description of the matter as a private dispute, acknowledged that employee complaints had reached Ethan's office without appropriate review, and confirmed an independent investigation whose findings would be released whether they favored him or not. Markets reacted immediately. The Mercer Group froze its participation, analysts questioned Ethan's judgment, and the board voted that evening to remove him temporarily as chairman while allowing him to remain chief executive under enhanced supervision. The price was not theatrical ruin, but it was real enough to alter his life. Bonuses tied to the acquisition vanished. Several directors publicly criticized him, a redevelopment schedule slipped, and lenders demanded new guarantees before negotiations could continue. Ethan refused to frame any of it as sacrifice when reporters gathered outside headquarters 3 days later. "I saw information that should have made me ask harder questions," he told them. Then, when acknowledging that failure threatened something I wanted to protect, I approved language that minimized the people who had already carried the consequences. When a reporter asked whether Caroline was responsible, Ethan said the investigation would determine individual conduct and that his own failure did not require anyone else's guilt to become real. Another reporter asked whether his feelings for Nia had influenced him, and Ethan answered after a pause, "Her dignity should never have depended on whether I cared about her personally." Nia watched part of the press conference from the back table of a small restaurant where she was pitching Carter Standard to Gloria Bennett, owner of 2 boutique hotels whose staffing costs had risen with turnover. She closed the video before Ethan finished because his accountability, however overdue, could not become the business model for her future. Gloria had already rejected her proposal once, not because she doubted Nia's philosophy, but because the training package required hotels to change supervisory incentives instead of merely conducting one-day workshops. Nia returned with revised metrics, showing how predictable scheduling, documented grievance pathways, and manager retention targets could lower replacement costs over 12 months. Gloria challenged every assumption for nearly an hour, then offered a 6-month pilot at one property instead of the 2-hotel contract Nia wanted. It was smaller than she needed and harder than accepting Ethan's money would have been, but she signed because the result would belong entirely to the work. Outside the restaurant, her bank account still frightened her. Reporters still occasionally waited near her apartment, and no inspirational music accompanied the fact that independence was often expensive before it became admirable. The Independent Review produced its first major reversal 2 weeks later, when investigators concluded that Caroline had not invented every complaint against Nia. Nia had indeed bypassed Caroline on several vendor decisions, corrected temporary staff without formal authority, and retained copies of anonymous operational information longer than household policy allowed, though none of the material contained private family data. Caroline's lawyers released those findings immediately, presenting them as proof that Nia had been a difficult employee with an agenda. For several hours, the public narrative shifted again, and Ethan's communications team urged him to defend Nia by revealing evidence of Caroline's retaliation. He refused because the review was not complete, and because he finally understood that believing Nia did not require pretending she had never made a professional mistake. Nia responded differently as well, telling Dana Holloway that she had exceeded her title because systems failed, and admitting she should have documented those decisions more formally. "Being right about mistreatment doesn't make me right about every decision I made," she said. "Accountability that only belongs to the person you dislike isn't accountability." That admission changed the story more powerfully than denial could have. And it also complicated Caroline in a way Ethan had resisted. During a private meeting arranged through counsel, Caroline arrived exhausted rather than immaculate, and admitted that Nia's competence had frightened her long before the pantry confrontation. Caroline had spent years learning that social power depended on appearing indispensable, while Nia entered a room, identified broken systems, and improved them without needing anyone's approval. "She made me feel replaceable in my own life," Caroline said, then immediately acknowledged how ugly the sentence sounded. Ethan asked whether she had authorized the leak of Carter Standard, and Caroline admitted sending the proposal to her family's public relations advisor after the confrontation, but denied ordering the anonymous attacks. She had wanted reporters to question Nia's motives, believing exposure would neutralize someone she considered a threat. "My mother taught me that if people see weakness once, they spend the rest of your life searching for it," she said. Ethan did not absolve her, though understanding the fear beneath her behavior made cruelty look more human without making it smaller. The final investigation later confirmed retaliatory scheduling, misuse of informal authority, improper sharing of Nia's business proposal, and repeated failures in Ethan's oversight, while finding no evidence that Caroline had physically threatened employees or that Nia had staged the pantry confrontation. Caroline issued an apology through counsel, agreed to confidential settlements with several former employees, and withdrew from public charitable boards connected to workplace advocacy rather than pretending nothing had happened. Ethan's acquisition survived only after new financing was assembled at less favorable terms, costing his company millions and delaying projects by nearly 4 months. He returned to the chairman role only after independent workplace oversight was extended beyond his residence, into executive offices and corporate properties, where domestic-style informal hierarchies had escaped normal human resources procedures. Through all of it, he did not contact Nia. The first proof that he was changing, he finally understood, would be whether he could continue changing without knowing she would ever reward him for it. 9 months later, Nia stood beneath the chandelier of the Whitfield Hotel, while 15 newly hired Carter Standard trainers gathered near the stage, arguing cheerfully about whose turn it was to fix a microphone that had failed during rehearsal. Her first year in business had contained none of the clean, upward motion strangers later preferred when telling success stories. Gloria's pilot nearly ended after one resistant manager falsified scheduling data, a Boston client paid 60 days late, and Nia once used most of her savings to cover payroll before an invoice cleared. What kept the company alive was not the publicity from the scandal, but measurable results, including lower turnover at Gloria's hotel, fewer overtime disputes, better guest ratings, and supervisors who learned that accountability could improve service rather than weaken authority. Former employees from Ethan's townhouse referred 2 early clients, while a private club in Brooklyn hired Carter Standard after Megan recommended Nia to its general manager. Tonight they were celebrating a 3-hotel contract large enough to support 15 full-time trainers and a small permanent office, though Nia still checked every expense twice because success had not erased the memory of watching her mother's medical bills decide which jobs she could afford to refuse. Above the stage, the Navy sign carried only the company's name and its promise. luxury service, human dignity. She noticed Ethan near the back wall after the final presentation, standing alone in a dark suit without reporters, assistants, sponsorship banners, or any visible attempt to become part of the evening. Gloria appeared beside Nia with 2 glasses of sparkling water and asked whether she had invited him, to which Nia answered that she had invited nearly 300 people. "That wasn't what I asked," Gloria said, smiling. Nia admitted that she had sent Ethan an invitation after debating the decision for almost a week, not because she had forgotten what happened, but because the person she had become no longer needed to protect herself by pretending the past had no emotional weight. Ethan waited until guests stopped approaching her before coming over, and even then he remained at a distance that allowed Nia to decide whether the conversation continued. "Congratulations," he said, glancing toward the stage. 15 trainers? Nia corrected him that it would be 18 if Philadelphia closed, and his smile appeared slowly. "Your hotel segment was always stronger than your residential projections." She raised an eyebrow. "I vaguely remember an irritating man mentioning that once." The ease of their exchange surprised both of them because neither had earned it through one dramatic apology. Nia knew from business coverage that Ethan's acquisition eventually closed without Mercer financing, at terms his board considered unnecessarily expensive, and that he had remained under independent oversight for months before directors restored his chairmanship. She also knew he had declined 2 opportunities to refer Carter Standard to companies connected with Whitmore, telling Gloria privately that any early business bearing his fingerprints would make Nia's success easier to question. "I almost hated you for that," Nia said after Gloria wandered away. Ethan looked startled, until she explained that there had been weeks when one referral from him would have solved payroll overnight. "Then I remembered why you didn't do it," she added. Ethan admitted that learning not to solve problems had felt unnatural because money and access had trained him to mistake intervention for care. "Gloria told me to mind my own business," he said. Nia smiled. "That sounds like the most valuable consulting you ever received." They moved toward a quieter corner after the ballroom began emptying, where Ethan told her he had come because he wanted to see what existed once nobody could plausibly credit him for building it. Nia asked what he saw, expecting perhaps one of the polished statements he had once used whenever emotion made him uncomfortable. "A company that would probably reject half my managers," he said. She laughed before she could stop herself, and he added more seriously that the place looked entirely hers. The simplicity of the answer mattered, because he did not describe her as extraordinary for surviving him, did not romanticize the months she had spent frightened about money, and did not turn her success into evidence that the damage had somehow been useful. Outside, Manhattan traffic moved beneath cold spring air as staff dismantled the event behind them. Ethan asked whether he could walk her to the subway, then corrected himself and asked whether she wanted company. Nia noticed the distinction and hated that she noticed it. At the corner, he stopped beneath a streetlight, his hands in his coat pockets as if resisting the instinct to use them while speaking. "There's something I should have said months ago, but saying it then would have been another way of asking you to manage my guilt," he began. Nia folded her arms against the wind and waited. Ethan admitted that when the board presented the financial risk, he had not merely feared losing the acquisition, he had feared becoming the kind of leader who could not keep every part of his life controlled. "You were the easiest person to make absorb that fear because I believed you would survive it," he said. That was not an accident, and it was not Caroline's fault. Nia looked across the avenue at people rushing toward trains, remembering the evening she had left his townhouse carrying her keys, and wondering whether she had just destroyed every reference she possessed. "I did survive," she said. Ethan nodded. "I know, and surviving doesn't reduce what I asked you to carry." She told him she forgave him, then watched relief begin in his face before adding what he already seemed prepared to hear. Forgiveness was not trust. Trust was not romance. And none of those things could be purchased retroactively by making better corporate decisions. Ethan said he understood and would not ask her for anything that night. After a moment, he glanced toward a small neighborhood restaurant glowing across the avenue and asked whether she might consider dinner the following Friday instead, somewhere with no private entrance, no photographers, and no wine list requiring a financial advisor. Nia laughed again, more freely this time. "One dinner," she said. "And you're not sending a car." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it when he saw her expression. "I was considering a taxi." "You were absolutely sending a car." His guilty smile answered for him. "Friday at 7, she said, before descending toward the subway, leaving Ethan on the sidewalk with no guarantee beyond a meal and no desire to negotiate for more. One dinner became another, only because the first contained nothing either of them needed to recover from afterward, and that ordinary success mattered more than candlelight or expensive food ever could have. Ethan chose a small restaurant downtown where they waited 20 minutes for a table because he had refused to call ahead and use his name, though Nia suspected the effort nearly caused him physical pain. They talked about Carter Standard, his delayed redevelopment projects, her mother's recovery, his father's habit of measuring love through achievement, and the ways both of them had confused independence with safety for different reasons. When Ethan offered advice about a difficult client, Nia asked whether she wanted advice before he gave it, then laughed at his expression because he realized the mistake halfway through. He apologized without becoming embarrassed enough to require reassurance, which she counted privately as progress. Their relationship grew through similarly unremarkable tests, canceled plans, disagreements about work, one argument over his instinct to hire security after a threatening email, and another over her habit of disappearing into problems rather than admitting when she needed help. Neither person transformed into someone easier. They became people more willing to let discomfort finish speaking. Caroline remained part of the history without remaining the villain who explained everything. Months after the investigation, Nia received a letter from her that contained no request for forgiveness and no claim that childhood pressure excused adult choices. Caroline acknowledged using Nia's employment status to make her doubt whether she would be believed, admitted sharing the business proposal because she wanted to damage Nia's credibility, and wrote that the cruelest part was how reasonable each decision had seemed while she was making it. Nia read the letter twice, placed it in a drawer, and never answered, understanding that accepting someone's accountability did not create an obligation to restore access to your life. Ethan saw Caroline only once during that year, at a legal closing related to the final settlement, where they exchanged a brief greeting and nothing more. He later told Nia he had spent years believing people were either loyal or dangerous because categories made leadership feel simpler. "That sounds exhausting," Nia said. "It was efficient." She gave him a look. "Those are not the same thing." Ethan smiled because the sentence no longer felt like an attack. Carter Standard expanded slowly enough that Nia could still recognize the people whose paychecks carried her name, which mattered to her more than the business press understood. She instituted anonymous reporting channels, predictable scheduling standards, manager evaluations tied to staff retention, and a rule that every executive trainee spend one full shift shadowing service workers before designing policies that affected them. The company was profitable by its second year, though Nia rejected acquisition offers that would have required abandoning the principles that made the work worth doing. Ethan never invested a dollar, never referred a client without being asked, and never appeared at company events unless invited as Nia's guest. What he did instead was smaller and harder for people accustomed to public gestures. He showed up on time, listened when the answer disappointed him, and learned that love did not become meaningful because it solved another person's life. Nia, for her part, learned that receiving care did not automatically create debt, though some nights accepting help still felt more frightening than doing everything herself. On a bright spring morning, nearly 2 years after she left the townhouse, Ethan arrived at Carter Standard's new office, carrying coffee for a meeting with Nia's executive team. He stopped outside the glass entrance when he saw her name etched across the door, remembering the first time he had discovered that same name attached to a business proposal he had approved without reading. Inside, employees moved between conference rooms, someone complained about a printer, and a young trainer argued cheerfully about whether a hospitality manual contained too many semicolons. Nothing about the office looked like rescue because nothing about it belonged to him. Before Ethan could reach for the handle, Nia opened the door from inside, wearing a navy suit and the watch that had belonged to her mother. "You're early," she said. Ethan lifted the coffee tray. "I've been experimenting with reliability." She checked her cup. "No sugar. Small amount of cream? I learn eventually." "That remains under review." He entered, but before she closed the door, he noticed a framed document near reception, small enough that most visitors would pass without reading it. It was not an award, a magazine cover, or the photograph from the interview that had first made her nationally visible. It was the original resignation letter from his townhouse, displayed beside a handwritten note from Nia to her staff. The note said that a workplace should never require silence as the price of belonging, and beneath it she had added something Ethan had never seen before. Leaving was not the victory. Building somewhere people could stay was. He stood reading until Nia came back to see what had delayed him. "You kept it," he said. She nodded because forgetting the door she had once needed to leave through would make the doors she now controlled mean less. Ethan asked whether she ever regretted giving him the envelope, and Nia considered the question before answering. "I regret that it had to exist. I don't regret making you decide what knowing would change." Later that evening, after a meeting that ran long and dinner neither had planned, they walked through Harlem beneath trees, beginning to leaf again. Ethan had been carrying a small ring box for nearly 3 weeks, but he had delayed using it because every elaborate proposal he imagined sounded too much like the old version of him arranging a room until uncertainty disappeared. Near Nia's apartment, he finally stopped, told her there was something he wanted to ask, and waited until she smiled because she knew from his face exactly how frightened he was. He did not kneel before a crowd, reserve a rooftop, or promise that loving her had made him a better man, because becoming better remained his responsibility, whether she married him or not. He simply said that the life they had built together felt honest enough that he wanted to keep building it, if she wanted the same thing. Nia looked at him for a long moment, then held out her hand before saying yes, not because he had rescued her, and not because she had redeemed him, but because both of them had finally learned how to stand beside another person without needing to own the ground beneath their feet. Their wedding the following autumn was small, warm, and almost aggressively ordinary by Ethan's old standards, with Gloria complaining about the flowers, Daniel crying before anyone else, and Nia's mother insisting on dancing longer than her doctor recommended. No reporters were invited, no merger depended on the guest list, and nobody described Nia as the housekeeper who married a billionaire because she had become too much herself for that sentence to hold her. After the reception, Ethan found her near an open doorway, watching staff clear tables, and he asked whether she was ready to leave. Nia glanced once at the room, then at the man beside her, remembering another doorway years earlier when leaving had been the only way to protect what remained hers. This time she reached for his hand, because staying was also her choice. Together they walked out through the front entrance, neither ahead nor behind, while the people inside continued laughing without noticing anything symbolic had happened at all. That was what made the ending feel true. Dignity had never been about who opened the door, only whether everyone involved was free to decide when to walk through it.